The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering the hydrangeas Robert planted 30 years ago. A woman's voice, clinical and distant, asked if I was the mother of Ruth Hartley. I said yes before I understood what that yes would cost me. She told me he'd been brought to St. Catherine's Hospital, that he'd overdosed, that I needed to come now. The watering can fell from my hand. Water pooled around my feet. I stood there watching it soak into the soil, thinking stupidly about whether the hydrangeas would drown. If Ruth's story is hitting you hard, this is just the beginning. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow her journey through betrayal, sacrifice, and transformation. Drop a comment below. Where are you listening to us from? Are you reading this at home, during your commute, or late at night when you can't sleep? We want to hear from you. Your support keeps these stories alive. Let's continue Ruth's confession. I drove to the hospital with my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. 40 years of marriage to Robert, and he'd never made me feel the way that drive did. My chest was caving in, like my ribs had become a cage for something trying to escape. Derek was my firstborn. I'd held him when he was minutes old, so small I could rest his entire weight in the crook of my arm. I thought I'd known him then. I thought I'd always know him. When I saw him in that hospital bed, pallid and thin, with tubes running into his arms like he was a plant someone forgot to water, I understood that the person I'd known had already died. This was something else wearing his face. The nurse said he'd had enough fentanyl in his system to kill 3 people. I asked how he'd survived. She didn't answer. We both knew survival wasn't the victory we were supposed to celebrate. Derek woke up sometime around midnight. His eyes found mine, and something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or calculation. I couldn't tell anymore. He started crying, saying he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, that it would never happen again. I believed him because I needed to believe him. A mother doesn't sit beside her son's hospital bed prepared for the alternative. I held his hand and made promises to God I wasn't sure still listened to me. By morning, a detective had come to talk to me in the hallway. Derek owed money. A lot of money. $250,000 to people who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. The detective said the word traffickers. He was commenting on the weather. He said Derek had been using for 3 years. 3 years. I did the math. That meant it started when Robert was still alive, when our family was still whole. The detective was still talking, but I'd stopped hearing him. My mind was stuck on the fact that I'd lived in a house with a son I didn't know, married to a husband who'd kept his own secrets, and I'd noticed nothing. Derek needed help I couldn't give him, and money I didn't have. The traffickers started calling the house within days. They knew my name. They knew when I went to the grocery store. One of them left a message on my answering machine, not a threat, exactly, but a promise wrapped in politeness. Mrs. Hartley, we need to discuss your son's situation. We're very reasonable people, but we're also very serious. I played it back 5 times, listening for the hidden meaning, the moment where I could have done something differently, something better. Derek manipulated me with the precision of someone who'd been practicing. He'd cry, then he'd rage, then he'd play dead-eyed and hollow, saying things like, "Mom, I don't want to live like this," in a voice that made it clear what "like this" meant. He'd tell me they were going to kill him. He'd say it so casually, he was commenting on the weather, and I'd feel my heart stop every time. I began to understand that love had become a weapon he knew exactly how to use against me, and I was desperate, even, to be wounded. The first crime I committed was small enough that I told myself it wasn't really a crime. I falsified a document at Derek's request, something to help him access a loan. My hands shook as I did it. I sat at Robert's old desk, his mahogany desk that he'd brought home from his law office when he retired, and I forged his signature on a piece of paper. I felt him watching me from wherever he was, disappointed in a way he'd never been in life. But I did it anyway. Derek needed the money. The traffickers were calling every day now. After that, the rest came easier. It shouldn't have, but it did. I took out a loan against the house Robert and I had bought with such hope, where we'd raised our children, where he'd held my hand the night before he died and told me I was the strongest person he knew. I used that money to pay part of Derek's debt. The bank approved it without questions. They were very helpful. I wondered if they could sense I was terrified, if they knew that desperation has a smell. 3 months into this descent, I was sitting in a support group for families of addicts, listening to a woman named Catherine Morris talk about her son. "He died 2 years ago," she said. "Overdose." She'd spent his final decade giving him money, making excuses, believing every promise he made about getting clean. She'd destroyed her own financial security. She'd alienated her other children, and none of it had mattered. He died anyway, and she'd been left with nothing but a house full of his belongings and a heart that had learned too late what enablement really meant. Catherine looked at me across that circle of folding chairs and fluorescent lights, and something in her eyes recognized something in mine. During the break, she came and sat next to me. She didn't offer comfort, thank God for that. Instead, she offered something harder: truth. She told me that loving Derek didn't mean I had to destroy myself for him. She told me she'd learned that lesson too late. She told me her other son hadn't spoken to her in 5 years because she'd chosen the addiction-sick one over her own sanity. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to tell her that Derek was different, that our situation was different, that my love would be enough to pull him back from the edge. But I was beginning to see the shape of a lie I'd been telling myself. The truth was, I was financing his addiction. I was making it easier for him to use. Every dollar I gave him was a dollar that didn't have to come from him, and he was using it to buy more of the thing that was killing him. That night, I went home to a house that no longer felt like mine. The doors were still the same doors. The windows were still the same windows. But something fundamental had shifted. I sat in Robert's chair, his leather chair where he used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings, and I realized I was living with a stranger. Derek had become someone I didn't recognize. And worse, I was becoming someone I didn't recognize either. The first time the traffickers came to the house, I was alone. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was in the garden trying to find some peace among the flowers when a man appeared at the fence. He wasn't threatening. He was almost pleasant. He said his name was Marcus Webb and that he and I needed to have a conversation about Derek's debt. He smiled like we were old friends negotiating a business deal, not a predatory criminal discussing extortion. He told me Derek had been a very good customer for a very long time, and that customers like Derek had families like mine who were willing to do almost anything to keep them alive. I told Marcus Webb that I didn't have $250,000. He nodded sympathetically. He said he understood, that most people didn't have that kind of money just lying around. But he also said that most people had houses, which were essentially money that hadn't been sold yet. He suggested I take out a larger loan against the property. He suggested I could be very creative about it. He smiled again, and I understood that he had done this before, many times, to many mothers just like me. After Marcus Webb left, I sat in the garden for 3 hours without moving. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shifted. My phone rang twice, Derek calling, but I didn't answer. I was trying to understand the exact moment when my love for my son had become indistinguishable from my fear of him. When had it happened? Was it gradual, like erosion, or had there been a single moment where I'd chosen terror over truth? I called the bank on Monday morning. I told them I wanted to refinance. The loan officer, a young woman named Jennifer with highlights in her hair and a practiced smile, walked me through the process like I was just another retiree looking to consolidate debt. She didn't ask many questions. "People refinance all the time," she said. It was perfectly normal. She quoted me a rate that made my stomach turn, but I signed anyway. Within 2 weeks, I had another $100,000 in my account, and the house that Robert and I had spent 40 years building equity in had become a weapon being held to my own throat. Derek received the money like it was his due. He didn't thank me. He didn't apologize. He just took it and disappeared for 3 days, and when he came back, he was thinner, and his eyes had that hollow look again. I asked him where the money had gone. He said it was handled, that the debt was being paid down, that everything was going to be fine now. I knew he was lying. I'd known him long enough to recognize the particular shape of his deception, the way his eyes moved slightly to the left before he spoke. But I wanted to believe him so desperately that I chose to. That's the thing nobody tells you about enabling someone you love. It's not just about the money or the crimes or the sacrifices. It's about the daily decision to believe the lie instead of the truth. It's about waking up every morning and choosing blindness because sight is too painful. The investigator's name was Diane Chen, and she appeared at my door on a Thursday afternoon with a warrant and a federal badge. She was smaller than I expected, with gray threading through her black hair and eyes that had seen too much. She didn't come in aggressively. She came in like someone who'd been to too many houses like mine, who'd seen too many mothers like me, and who'd developed a particular kind of patience for the process. Diane laid out the evidence on my kitchen table like a card player revealing her hand. Bank statements, forged documents, loan applications with false information. A timeline of crimes that I'd committed, each one meticulously documented, each one carrying its own potential prison sentence. She didn't lecture me. She didn't moralize. She just laid it all out and waited for me to understand the scope of what I'd done. "You're looking at federal charges, Mrs. Hartley," she said finally, her voice gentle in a way that made it worse. "Fraud, document falsification, conspiracy. You could go to prison." She paused, and in that pause, I felt my entire life compress into a single moment. "But I'm not here to arrest you today." I asked her why. She leaned back in the chair, Robert's chair, the one across from where I was sitting, and she told me that she'd been tracking Marcus Webb's operation for 18 months. She knew about the predatory lending, the targeted recruitment of young addicts, the systematic extraction of money from families who loved them. She knew that Derek was one of dozens, maybe hundreds of addicts being fed a steady supply of opioids specifically because their families would pay anything to save them. Diane told me that if I cooperated, if I helped her build a case against Marcus Webb and his network, the federal government would consider reducing my charges. She told me I could help stop this from happening to other families. She told me I could be an informant, that I could wear a wire, that I could help take down the operation that had turned my love for my son into a crime. I should have said no. I should have called a lawyer. I should have protected myself. But instead, I found myself nodding, found myself agreeing to betray Derek in order to save him, though I didn't understand that's what I was doing. Not yet. Working with Diane Chen meant entering a world I didn't know existed. She taught me how to record conversations, how to extract information, how to talk to Derek without tipping him off. She taught me the language of criminal investigation, conspiracy, racketeering, distribution networks. She taught me that my son was less of a person and more of a product in a system designed to extract money from people like me. Derek didn't notice anything different at first. I was still his mother. I was still available, still worried, still willing to listen. But now I was also listening on behalf of the federal government. Every conversation we had was being recorded. Every piece of information he gave me about Marcus Webb, about the supply chain, about the other addicts in the network, was being documented and filed away as evidence. I felt like a ghost moving through my own life. I'd wake up in the morning and make coffee like a normal person. I'd tend the hydrangeas like a normal person. I'd go to the support group and listen to Catherine talk about her dead son like a normal person. But I was also recording my own child. I was also building a case against him. One night, about 6 weeks into my work with Diane, I received a call from the bank. There was an issue with one of my accounts, they said. They needed me to come in and verify some transactions. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday, assuming it was some kind of routine maintenance. It wasn't routine. When I arrived at the bank, a manager led me to a private office where a woman was waiting with a stack of documents. The woman's name was Patricia, and she was the senior auditor for the bank's fraud investigation unit. She told me they'd discovered something unusual in our accounts, specifically in Robert's accounts I didn't know about, accounts that had been active for over 15 years. Patricia spread the statements across the desk, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Robert had a second account. Not a secret account exactly. He wasn't hiding money from me for selfish reasons, but a compartmentalized account that I'd never known about. Over 15 years, He'd been sending regular transfers to someone named David Chen. 15 years of consistent payments. 15 years of money flowing out of our accounts to someone whose name I didn't recognize. My hands started shaking. Patricia was asking me questions. Did I know who David Chen was? Had Robert ever mentioned him? Did I authorize these transactions? But I couldn't focus on her words. I was doing the math in my head. Robert retired 20 years ago. This account had been active for 15. That meant he'd started it 5 years into retirement, around the same time that Derek's drug use had supposedly begun. I asked Patricia if there was any additional information about David Chen. She said there was an address on file from the original account setup. She slid a piece of paper across to me. The address was in Portland, Oregon. I stared at it like it was written in a language I didn't understand. That night, I sat down at Robert's computer, his old laptop that had been sitting in the office untouched since his death, and I did something I'd never done before. I looked through his email history. I wasn't proud of it. I was violating his privacy, violating the memory of a man I'd loved and trusted, but I had to know. It took me an hour to find them, buried in a folder labeled Medical Records. A series of emails between Robert and a woman named Sarah Chen, dated over 20 years ago. They were love letters, essentially, though not explicitly sexual. They were conversations about a relationship that had existed before Robert and I were married, before we had Derek, before we built this life together. They ended abruptly in 2003, with Sarah writing, "Robert, I understand. You've made your choice, but he's your son too." I printed out the emails and sat at the kitchen table with them in front of me. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of believing I knew a man completely, and I'd known nothing. Robert had a son, Derek's half-brother, that he'd been supporting in secret. A son who apparently struggled with addiction, just like Derek. A son named David Chen. The connection clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. Derek wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He wasn't just an isolated case. He had genetics working against him. Inherited predispositions running through his blood from a father he'd never known about. And Robert had known. Robert had lived his entire second half of life knowing that his addiction-prone son existed, and he'd tried to save him the same way I was trying to save Derek. With money, with secrecy, with the kind of love that destroys everyone it touches. I called Diane Chen that night. I told her what I'd found. I told her about Robert's secret account, about the emails, about the half-brother in Portland. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Diane said something that I'll never forget. "That's not a coincidence, Mrs. Hartley. That's information we need to investigate." It turned out that David Chen, my husband's secret son, was also connected to Marcus Webb's network. He'd been clean for 10 years, but he'd made the introduction between Derek and Marcus. He didn't know what he was doing at the time. He thought he was just helping his half-brother find pain medication after a dental surgery. But Marcus Webb had been watching, waiting, ready to turn a simple introduction into a long-term revenue stream. The predatory system was worse than I'd imagined. It didn't just hunt for vulnerable addicts. It hunted for families with money. It used genetics, obligation, and love as weapons. It knew that people like Robert, like me, would sacrifice everything rather than lose a child. I called David Chen before Diane could. I found his number through a private investigator that Diane recommended, and I dialed it with my heart hammering in my chest. A man answered on the third ring, cautious, like he wasn't used to receiving calls from unknown numbers. I told him who I was. I told him that his father had been my husband. I told him that I'd found the emails, the bank statements, the evidence of a life Robert had lived in parallel to the one I thought we shared. There was silence on the other end. Then David said, "I was wondering when someone would call me about this." His voice was steady, but I could hear something underneath it. Resignation, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent a decade learning to live with inherited trauma. He told me he'd been clean for 10 years. He told me that Robert had paid for his first 3 stints in rehab. He told me that his father had died without ever telling me about him, and that he'd accepted that as the price of his existence. I asked David how he'd met Derek. He said it was at a recovery meeting in Portland, about 5 years ago. Derek had come to visit, and David had brought him along, thinking it might help him understand addiction better. Derek had seemed interested, seemed like he wanted to get help. But then, Derek had disappeared from the meetings, and when David heard through mutual acquaintances that Derek was using again, David had felt responsible. He'd made an introduction to someone he thought could help, a man named Marcus Webb, who claimed to have connections to pain management specialists. David didn't know at the time that Marcus Webb was a predator. He didn't know that he was introducing his half-brother to a carefully constructed trap. He'd only learned the truth after Diane Chen had contacted him, after the federal investigation had connected the dots that he'd unknowingly helped create. "I destroyed my half-brother's life without meaning to," David said, and I heard genuine anguish in his voice. "And now my father is dead, and I'll never be able to apologize to him for what I didn't know I was doing." I told David that his father hadn't blamed him. I told him about the emails, about how Robert had been trying to save him for 20 years. I told him that Robert had loved him in the only way a man living a double life could manage, from a distance, with money, with the kind of quiet devotion that nobody noticed until it was too late to thank him for it. David wept. I listened, and in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just talking to my husband's secret son. I was talking to a mirror of my own situation. David had spent a decade trying to recover from addiction while carrying the weight of his father's secret love. Derek was heading toward a lifetime of addiction while carrying the weight of his own denial. And I was caught in the middle, trying to love both of them without destroying myself in the process. After I hung up with David, I sat in the darkness of my living room and I finally let myself cry. Not for Derek, not for Robert, not for the life I thought I'd had. I cried for the woman I'd been before that Tuesday morning phone call, the woman who'd watered her hydrangeas without knowing that her entire world was constructed on lies. The following week, I attended the support group meeting with Catherine. I told her about David. I told her about Robert's secret account. I told her about the predatory system that had been designed specifically to exploit families like ours. I told her everything. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached over and took my hand. She said, "Ruth, you know what the cruelest part is? We can't save them. We never could. All we can do is decide whether we're going to go down with them or whether we're going to save ourselves." That night, I made a decision. I was going to cooperate fully with Diane Chen. I was going to wear the wire. I was going to record every conversation with Derek, every transaction with Marcus Webb's network. I was going to build the case that would bring the entire operation down, even if it meant destroying my son in the process, even if it meant admitting that I'd failed him. The first recorded conversation with Derek was the hardest. I knew he was lying before he opened his mouth. I could read the particular tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. I was supposed to ask him about money, whether he needed more, whether the debt was being paid down, whether he was staying clean. But what I really wanted to ask was, when did you decide to use me? When did you realize that my love was a commodity you could trade? Instead, I smiled. I made him tea. I asked if he was hungry. And when he told me that the traffickers were getting impatient, that they were threatening him again, that he needed another $50,000 or they were going to hurt him, I put my hand over my heart and I said, "Oh, Derek, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'll figure it out." Every word was being recorded. Every lie was being documented. Every manipulation was being filed away as evidence. Derek left that day with the promise of money, and I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, listening to the playback of my own voice, calm, steady, the voice of a mother who would do anything for her son. But beneath that voice was another voice, one that nobody could hear but me. A voice that was finally telling the truth. Diane called me that evening. She said the recording was good. She said it was exactly what she needed. She said we were getting close to having enough to move on Marcus Webb. She said Derek would likely be arrested as part of the conspiracy, but that his cooperation, which I was facilitating, would look good for him in court. I asked her if Derek would go to prison. She said probably, but not for as long as he would have if Marcus Webb hadn't been taken down. She said Derek would have a chance to get clean in federal prison, where there was structure and medical care and the possibility of rehabilitation. She said it was more than a lot of addicts got. more than a lot of addicts got. As if prison was a gift. As if incarceration was the best outcome we could hope for. But what was the alternative? Let him keep using. Let Marcus Webb keep feeding him poison? Let him die in the same way Catherine's son had died, with his mother sitting beside his hospital bed, trying to understand where love had turned into complicity. I called my daughter Vanessa that night. We hadn't spoken in 8 months. I'd chosen Derek over her so many times, prioritizing his crisis, his needs, his drama, that she'd eventually stopped calling. She'd sent me an email on my birthday, a perfunctory message with no warmth in it. I'd read it and understood that I'd broken something in her that my apologies couldn't fix. When she answered the phone, her voice was guarded. "Hi, Mom," she said, like she was bracing for bad news. I told her everything. I told her about Derek's addiction, about the debt to the traffickers, about the crimes I'd committed to try to save him. I told her about Robert's secret son, about the genetic predisposition to addiction that had been lurking in our family tree like an inherited disease. I told her that I'd been cooperating with federal investigators and that Derek would likely be arrested. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, I've been waiting for you to tell me the truth for 8 months. I knew something was wrong. I could feel you pulling away from me. And instead of asking me for help, instead of letting me in, you just disappeared into Derek's problem." I tried to explain. I tried to tell her that I was doing everything I could, that Derek's situation was desperate, that I couldn't just abandon my son. But the words sounded hollow, even as I spoke them. Vanessa listened to me make excuses for myself, and then she said something that cut through all of my justifications. "You did abandon a son, Mom. You abandoned me." After we hung up, I sat in the darkness, and I understood that my choice to save Derek had actually been a choice to lose Vanessa. That every dollar I'd spent on his debt, every crime I'd committed to keep him alive, every moment I'd spent worrying about his future, all of it had come from a finite resource of love and attention that I should have been dividing equally among my children. Catherine had been right. There were no good choices here. There were only different ways of losing people you loved. Over the next 3 months, I recorded 17 more conversations with Derek. Each one followed a similar pattern. He would express fear, I would offer reassurance, he would ask for money, I would promise to find it. Each recording was a little piece of rope I was fashioning into a noose for my own son. Diane told me that the case was building beautifully. She said they had enough to move on Marcus Webb, that they were close to making arrests. She said Derek's cooperation, which meant my cooperation, which meant my betrayal, was going to help take down a network that had destroyed hundreds of families. I asked her if that made what I was doing right. She looked at me with those tired federal investigator eyes, and she said, "I don't know if it makes it right, Mrs. Hartley, but I know it makes it necessary." The day they arrested Marcus Webb, I was sitting in my garden. Diane called me and told me it was happening. She said Marcus Webb was being taken into custody at his home in Boston. She said that simultaneously, raids were being conducted on 7 other locations connected to the network. She said that Derek was being arrested at his apartment, where they'd found 2 kilograms of fentanyl and $30,000 in cash. I sat among the hydrangeas that Robert had planted, among the flowers that had bloomed every spring for 3 decades, and I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no sense of justice served, just a hollow emptiness where my son's life used to be. Derek called me from federal custody. He didn't scream at me. He didn't accuse me. He just said, very quietly, "Mom, why did you do this?" And I couldn't tell him the truth, that I'd done it because I loved him, because I couldn't save him, because the only way to stop him from destroying himself was to let the system destroy him first. So I just sat there holding the phone, listening to my son breathe on the other end of the line, understanding that I'd destroyed something that couldn't be rebuilt. The federal charges against me were formally dropped 6 months later. Diane Chen stood beside me in the courthouse and watched as the judge sealed my record. She told me I was free to go, that I'd done my duty, that I should go home and try to rebuild my life. She said it like rebuilding a life was a simple thing. It was something you could do over a weekend. The foundation of who you were hadn't been demolished brick by brick. I drove home to a house that felt like a museum of someone else's life. The hydrangeas were blooming. The mailbox was full. The refrigerator still had the same brand of milk Robert had preferred, even though he'd been dead for 5 years. I opened all the windows and let the air move through the rooms, trying to blow out the ghosts. Vanessa came to see me the day after the charges were dropped. She brought her 2 children with her, my grandchildren, who I barely knew because I'd been so consumed with Derek that I'd forgotten to be a grandmother. They were shy with me, uncertain, like they were meeting a relative they'd only heard about in whispered conversations. I made them lunch and watched them eat, and I realized that I'd lost an entire chapter of their lives while I was busy trying to save my son from himself. That night, after the children were asleep in the guest room, Vanessa and I sat in the living room, and we talked for the first time in real honesty. She told me about the years she'd spent watching me choose Derek. She told me about her own struggles, the divorce that had nearly broken her, the financial difficulties she'd faced, the times she'd called me and gotten voicemail because I was at the hospital with Derek. She told me that she'd learned to stop expecting me to be there for her, and that in learning that, she'd lost something essential, her belief that her mother loved her as much as she loved her brother. I apologized. I said it over and over. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. But the words felt inadequate. An apology can't restore lost time. It can't unbreak trust. It can only acknowledge that you've caused damage and express your intention not to cause it again, which is almost nothing when you think about it. But Vanessa accepted my apology with a kind of weary grace. She said, "I don't need you to be perfect, Mom. I just need you to see me now. I need you to be present for what's left." And I promised her that I would be. I promised her that Derek's crisis had ended one kind of chapter in my life, and that I was ready to begin another. Catherine came to the house a week later. She brought wine and cheese, and we sat in the garden among the hydrangeas. I told her that I'd betrayed Derek, that I'd worn a wire and built a case against him, that he was now serving 3 years in federal prison for conspiracy and drug trafficking. I told her that I didn't know if I'd done the right thing, and that I wasn't sure I'd ever know. Catherine raised her glass to mine. She said, "Ruth, my son is dead. He'll never get the chance to go to prison, never get the chance to be rehabilitated, never get the chance to recover and build a new life. Derek has all of those chances ahead of him. You didn't destroy his future. You just made it harder in the short term so that he could have a future at all." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel like I'd made the right choice. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that I'd made the only choice available to me, and it was a choice that had cost me my relationship with my son in exchange for his potential salvation. Whether that was worth it, I still didn't know. 2 months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from David Chen. He wrote that he'd been thinking about me, about the strange connection we shared through Robert. He wrote that he'd been clean for 10 years, and that he wanted to invite me to Portland to meet him in person. He wrote that he thought we should know each other, that we were family in a way that was unconventional, but real. I went to Portland in the fall. I flew out on a Saturday morning and rented a car, and I drove to an address in a quiet neighborhood where David Chen lived with his wife and their 2 teenage children. They invited me into their home like I was a long-lost relative, which I suppose I was. We had coffee. We looked at pictures of Robert that David had kept, photographs of my husband in a life I'd never seen, smiling in ways I'd never seen him smile. David told me that Robert had been a good father, despite the circumstances. He told me that Robert had shown up for his first recovery, had paid for his education, had believed in his ability to get better. He told me that he'd spent his adult life trying to be worthy of the sacrifices his father had made. I asked David if he thought Robert had done the right thing by keeping him a secret. David thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "I think my father did what he thought was necessary to protect both of his families. I think he made an impossible choice and lived with it for 40 years. And I think that maybe the fact that we're here now, having this conversation, means that his choice wasn't entirely wrong." On my last night in Portland, David's wife took me to dinner while David stayed home with the children. Her name was Margaret, and she'd never met Robert, but she'd heard all of David's stories about him. She told me that she'd watched David struggle with the shame of his addiction for years, and that he'd finally been able to let it go when he understood that addiction wasn't a moral failing. It was a disease, a predisposition, a way that some brains were wired to seek escape. I asked her if she thought Derek would ever recover. She said, "I don't know, Derek, but I know that recovery is possible. And I know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to step back and let them hit bottom, and then be there when they're ready to climb back up." I returned to Boston with a renewed sense of purpose. I began attending the support group meetings regularly again. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and intergenerational addiction. I began the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding my relationship with Vanessa, one conversation at a time. 6 months after I returned from Portland, I received a letter from Derek. It was forwarded through the prison system, and his handwriting was shaky. It had taken him a long time to write. He apologized. He said he understood now why I'd done what I'd done. He said that prison had given him something he needed: structure, consequence, and time to think about the life he'd been living. He wrote, "Mom, I know you betrayed me. I know you wore a wire and helped them lock me up. But I also know that I was going to die if something didn't change. I was going to overdose, and you were going to bury me. And you would have spent the rest of your life wondering if you could have done more. Instead, you did the hardest thing a mother could do. You let me fall. I just needed to know that you'd be there to catch me on the way down." I read that letter 17 times. I wept reading it. I read it again every time I doubted whether I'd made the right choice. And slowly, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't something Derek was offering me. It was something he was offering himself: permission to move forward, permission to believe that his future didn't have to be defined by his past. I began to plan something I'd never allowed myself to dream about. Robert had always wanted to take a trip to Ghana, to visit Accra, to walk on the beaches where his ancestors had come from, to reconnect with a part of his history that had been stolen from his family generations ago. He'd talked about it for years, but we'd never gone. Life had been too busy, too full, too committed to building a foundation that had turned out to be constructed on lies anyway. I booked the trip for the following summer. I was going to go alone. I was going to walk on those beaches and scatter some of Robert's ashes I'd been keeping in a ceramic urn on my nightstand for 5 years. And I was going to reclaim a piece of the life that had been stolen from both of us. But before I went, I needed to do something else. I needed to visit Derek in prison. I hadn't seen him since the day he was arrested. I'd been too angry, too ashamed, too afraid of what I would feel if I looked into his eyes and saw the damage I'd caused. But now, standing outside the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, I understood that I needed to see him not for his sake, but for mine. I needed to look at my son and recognize him as something separate from my guilt. Derek came into the visitation room looking older. 3 years in prison had aged him in ways that time alone couldn't explain. His hair was starting to gray, his face was thinner, more defined, but his eyes were clear for the first time in years. They were the eyes of someone who'd finally stopped running. We sat across from each other at a table designed for this exact moment: the reconciliation between captor and captive, between mother and betrayed son. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Derek reached across the table and took my hand. "Hi, Mom," he said. And I heard in those 2 words an entire lifetime of understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Acceptance that we'd both done what we thought was necessary. That love had been complicated and flawed and sometimes destructive. Acceptance that we were both trying to survive. We talked for 3 hours. Derek told me about his time in prison. He told me about the therapy groups, about the addiction counseling, about the way structure had actually saved his life. He told me that he was working in the prison kitchen and that he'd been clean for 3 years straight. He told me that he'd started reading books, that he'd been thinking about what he wanted to do when he got out. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He didn't ask me to feel guilty about turning him in. He just talked to me like I was his mother again. We'd move past the crisis and into whatever came next. Before I left, Derek told me something that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, You know what I realized in here? I realized that I was trying to use you to avoid feeling pain. Every time I asked you for money, every time I told you they were going to kill me, I was trying to outsource my suffering to you. And you finally refused. You refused to carry my pain for me. And that's when I could finally learn to carry it myself. I drove home from the prison with the windows down and the radio off, just listening to the sound of the highway. I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy, that wasn't quite the right word, but unburdened. I'd spent so long trying to fix Derek, trying to save him, trying to be enough. And I'd finally learned that no amount of sacrifice could substitute for his own choice to change. The support group meeting that night was different. Catherine stood up and announced that she'd been asked to facilitate a new group specifically for parents who were struggling with the question of when to help and when to let go. She looked at me across the room and asked if I would co-facilitate with her. She said we both understood the cost of love that had become enabling. She said we both understood the weight of impossible choices. I said yes. I didn't know if I was qualified to help other parents. I didn't know if my story was something that should be shared. But I knew that if even one mother could avoid the path I'd taken, could understand earlier than I had, that love sometimes means boundaries, that sacrifice sometimes means saying no, then my suffering would have meaning. The night before I left for Ghana, I sat in my garden one last time before the trip. The hydrangeas had bloomed for the 31st consecutive spring since Robert planted them. They were massive now, towering over my head, their flowers almost purple in the evening light. I thought about Robert planting them all those years ago, thinking he was building something permanent, not knowing that the most important things in life were the ones he was keeping secret. I reached into my purse and I pulled out the ceramic urn containing Robert's ashes. I opened it and I looked inside at the gray powder that was all that remained of a man I'd loved for 40 years. I thought about everything he'd hidden from me. I thought about everything I'd hidden from myself, and I understood, finally, that the keeping of secrets had destroyed us more thoroughly than any truth ever could have. I scattered half of Robert's ashes into the garden, into the soil where the hydrangeas grew. I said a prayer, not to God, exactly, but to the universe, to time, to the possibility of redemption. I said, Robert, I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to go to Ghana. I'm going to walk on the beaches. I'm going to reclaim the life you couldn't. And I'm going to be okay. The following morning, I boarded a plane to Accra. I was 68 years old, and I was traveling alone for the first time in my life. I was terrified. I was exhilarated. I was finally free. I walked on the beaches of Ghana, and I felt the sand between my toes, and I felt the Atlantic Ocean on my skin, and I realized that this was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of pain, but the choice to live beyond it. Not the absence of love, but love that was conditional on my own survival. I met a woman in a coffee shop in Accra. Her name was Amma, and she was a social worker who worked with families affected by addiction. We talked for hours. I told her my story. She told me hers. She said, "Love is not about sacrifice. Love is about choosing to be present. And sometimes being present means being absent. Sometimes it means saying no." I scattered the rest of Robert's ashes into the ocean at sunset. I stood on the beach and I watched them disappear into the water, and I felt him finally let go of me. Or maybe I finally let go of him. Either way, something released, a knot in my chest that I'd been carrying since the moment that hospital called. When I returned to Boston, I felt different. Not healed. Healing isn't a destination, it's a continuous process, but transformed. I was no longer the woman who'd prioritized her son's survival over her own integrity. I was no longer the woman who believed that love meant destruction. I was Ruth. I was a mother. I was a daughter mourning a husband I'd never fully known. I was a woman learning that my worth wasn't determined by how much I was willing to sacrifice, but by how clearly I could see the truth and still choose to move forward. Derek was released from prison 3 years later. He went to a halfway house. He got a job. He started attending recovery meetings. He rebuilt his life one day at a time, and I supported him from a healthy distance. I didn't rescue him. I didn't enable him. I loved him, but I loved myself more. Vanessa and I became close again. I was present for her children's graduations and their heartbreaks and their victories. I was a grandmother, not just biologically, but emotionally. I was a mother who could say no, and I did, and it made me a better mother. Catherine and I co-facilitated the support group for 5 years. We helped dozens of parents understand the difference between love and enabling, between sacrifice and self-destruction. We told our stories, and people cried, and people were angry, and people left understanding something they hadn't understood before. That the most powerful act of love is sometimes the one that costs you everything except your integrity. 5 years after I returned from Ghana, I received a letter from my enteado, my stepson, though I'd never called him that until I realized how much he meant to me. David wrote that he and his family were moving back to Boston. He wrote that he wanted his children to know their extended family. He wrote that he wanted us to build something that Robert hadn't been able to build, a family that didn't have to hide, that didn't have to compartmentalize love. They moved into a house 3 neighborhoods away. We had dinner together every Sunday. David's children called me Grandma Ruth. Derek, when he was allowed visitors, came to those dinners too. We sat around my table, the table that Robert and I had bought together 40 years ago. And we ate and we talked, and we were, for the first time, an honest family. I am 73 now. Derek is sober and working in construction. Vanessa is married to a woman named Sophie, and they've adopted a child from foster care. David's children are in college. Catherine passed away 2 years ago, peacefully, surrounded by her family. I speak at addiction conferences now. I tell my story to rooms full of social workers and counselors and parents who are drowning in the same desperation I once felt. I tell them this: love is not infinite. Your capacity to sacrifice is not bottomless. Saying no to someone you love is not betrayal, it's survival. And sometimes the greatest act of love you can perform is to step back and let someone else decide whether they want to live or die, and then respect their choice, whatever it is. I tell them that Robert kept secrets for 40 years and it destroyed him. I tell them that I kept secrets for 3 years and it nearly destroyed me. I tell them that Derek had to go to prison to finally see the truth, and that I had to betray my son to finally see myself. I tell them, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. And sometimes, protecting yourself is the most amorously thing you can do. Sometimes, love means letting go. Sometimes, love means walking away. Sometimes, love means standing at the airport with a one-way ticket and refusing to look back. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love means that when you do look back, you see not the wreckage you left behind, but the foundation you've laid for something new, something honest, something real. The hydrangeas are still blooming in my garden. They bloom every spring, as they have for 36 years now. But I don't water them the way I used to. I let the rain do its work. I let nature take its course. I've learned that not everything needs my intervention to survive. And some things are more beautiful when they're allowed to bloom on their own. This is my confession. This is my story. This is the moment when I finally understood I was never meant to save anyone. I was only ever meant to save myself.